Arthur Bain, the Greens candidate for the seat of Oxley for the New South Wales state election. We're at the Bellingen Youth Hub. Welcome, Arthur.
Thank you.
Tell us a bit about your history. What qualifies you to be running for this state election?
First, I'd like to say G'nagay and acknowledge that we're meeting in Gumbaynggirr country and pay respect to elders past, present and future. Why am I qualified to be the representative for Oxley? I believe there's a couple of things. I am a good learner, I'm a good communicator, and I'm passionate about the environment and social justice. I've been an educator most of my life, since I left school, in a whole variety of different formats. I've worked closely with Indigenous communities. I've worked in the school system and the TAFE system. I was a principal of a small school for a long time, and now I'm currently employed by the Department of Justice working with vulnerable families. So I'm on the front line of social justice, seeing the impacts of poor social housing, lack of mental health funding, drug and alcohol problems and domestic violence. So I have a grassroots connection to people and see how government policy impacts on people's lives. As far as environment goes, I have never been an activist, but I am an environmentalist. Some examples of that: I moved up to the Macleay in 1991 and lived right out in the bush. Sort of built a shack and chop before Enlightenment, chop wood, fetch water. After Enlightenment, chop wood, fetch water. And I saw the impacts of logging firsthand. I was really concerned. There was an activist movement up there in the Nulla 5-day state forest, and my partner and I supported them by, they could use our phone, have a shower, put their car behind the house so police couldn't see where it was. But I was very concerned that I also know people that work in state forests, and I know people that are in the industry. So I don't want antagonism, I want to find solutions. And it was during that process that I realised the power of the witness. Once the activists had left, and what I learnt from the activists was what the laws are on logging, and snigging logs downhill, leaving erosion controls, reseeding, and what sustainable, sensitive logging looks like as opposed to industrial mayhem. So for months after the activists had left, I went up to the logging areas every weekend, took photographs, connected with the district forester, and I believe I had an impact on keeping the bastards honest.
Right. Well, being the Greens candidate, how do you find the current government are going with the environment and renewable energy?
Oh, well, the environment, major concerns about the integrated forestry operations agreements. It's frightening that they're reducing riparian buffer zones from 10 metres to 5 metres. The new agreements are exempt from federal environmental protection laws, so that's been a deal done between the state government and the federal government. And they're rezoning old growth timber areas that in the past have been protected are now being classified as harvestable. As far as renewables go, this is a blank space, and with climate change, accelerated climate change driven by global warming, we have to address this as a top priority that needs to be addressed. The Greens have some really great policies on renewables. We're talking about creating a state-owned Power New South Wales, a power company which will be involved in generation, so 100% renewable generation, distribution and the retail. So that will save consumers money. We can knock $300 a year off people's electricity bills. In addition, there's the Cool Homes, Cool Planet initiative, which is about to begin with by renovating social housing and then putting in incentives for private owners to renovate their housing to make it zero emissions. One of the gaps here is rental. Some of the most vulnerable people in social housing and in rental properties haven't got the access to put solar panels on their roof, so therefore they're faced with rising electricity bills, increasing emissions, and that's just not fair, and we need to address that and create employment in the renewables industry.
If you did win the seat, how does one person manage to get all that through government?
Well, it's a very interesting question because I have clear targets for realistic optimism in Oxley. Our last result in the election was 14.7% of the primary vote. Our realistic target is 17 to 20%, sending a strong message to whoever wins the seat that environment and social justice are important issues. However, what if the Greens had the balance of power in the state government? Well, then we could do a lot. we could do a lot because we'd be in a position of saying, we need some funding for this, let's try that.
I find with the Greens that they're very good on the environmental side and things. How do they then make the move over to covering all the other issues? Is that how important is that to the Greens?
Can you give me an example of what issue?
Let's say creating jobs on the mid-north coast.
Creating job creation is tied in with environment and social justice, as I see it. I was at the Farmers Forum on Wednesday night. They were talking about the jobs that can be created if there are organic food markets, the jobs that can be created in growing food biodynamically and organically. One of the things that I'd be looking at is increasing funding to national parks. I think national parks have been savagely damaged by the restructures, and we need more rangers on the ground, particularly Indigenous rangers, because a lot of our national parks are in a mess. And National Party grassroots farmers and graziers say to me all the time, what's the go with the national parks? They're a source of feral pests, animals and weeds. We need to get people working in there to clean those up. And if we can learn from Indigenous people about traditional ways of managing the land, then that's a really positive win-win all the way around. I think we need to fix the current estate of national parks that we have, and then grow it, and we need a formula for saying there must be this many jobs that go with this much land that's gazetted as national park.
Well,
Similarly,
why do you think the government's been slashing funds to the national parks?
The government supports all forms of privatisation. They've oversold timber to multinational corporations, timber contracts. We pay $10 million a year in penalties because we can't meet our timber our timber commitments, which is why the new forestry agreements are so dangerous.
So what about plantations of trees?
Plantations is part of our policy, but I'd like to say more about that, because if we're looking at monoculture plantations, we're not looking at improving environmental health. We need to be looking at mixed plantations, forest farming, and integrating that into a mixed farming scenario where we will have a future-proofed, prosperous food production industry. Another idea I've had particularly around employment, which is so important in this area, is what I'm calling an integrated employment program. On one hand, we've got masses of unemployed people. On the other hand, we've got masses of environmental repair that need to be done. Let's put those together in an integrated way. But particularly one of my passions is around the corrective services industry. 48% of our inmates end up back in jail within 2 years. In Denmark, they're closing jails because they provide stable housing and employment on release. So we offer this is a germ of an idea of offering an employment program to long-term unemployed and prisoners on post-release, inmates post-release, of saying you can work for minimum wage in work crews of 8 people with a supervisor, going out and doing riparian repair. And there's a million jobs that Landcare have a list of priorities. So that would start off by fencing off stock from access to waterways, eradicating weeds, and planting native vegetation to protect the waterways. So that's going to provide employment, but you combine that with Certificate 1 and Certificate 2 in rural studies and or horticulture, and you're building a workforce. It's not a 1-year gig, because once one job is finished, you can go on to the next job. Started off small as a trial and expanded as it works. As far as fiscal responsibility goes, it's half the price of keeping a person in jail for 12 months. Having them in full-time employment, they're spending money in their community, stimulating the economy. The social cost of unemployment is reduced, and you could, if the model works, you can expand it, and then you could also expand it into fixing the stock of social housing that we have, doing Certificate 1 and 2 in building and construction, and repairing the social housing the repair and maintenance of social housing, which is so much needed, and then moving on to construction of new social housing in consultation with the communities that are going to live there. Because at the moment, it's like putting a square peg in a round hole. With collaboration and consultation, we could build social housing which is environmentally friendly, socially inclusive, and works for the people that live in it. These programs wouldn't end after 12 months. They're not a short-term fix. They could continue. So a participant could say, well, I've got work experience, I can get a reference, I can apply for jobs, or they can continue, and you could say, well, how about going up to certificate 3 or 4? How about you become a work crew leader? And so that then there's a pathway. The spin-offs then would be immense in bringing money into communities. As far as riparian repair is concerned, what is going to incentivise graziers to fence their stock off and have their rivers repaired? I've been talking to some of the graziers around this, and some of the incentives could be, well, if the government was going to pay half, you could also give them the pumps, the tanks and the troughs that they would need to water their stock at wholesale rates. Those are details that could really be worked through and build partnerships.
Would you privatise something like that, or would you have a government run?
Definitely not. Definitely not privatising. I think social housing, for example, has recently been privatised right across the mid-north coast. Community Housing Limited, which is a non-profit, non-government organisation, now manage the entire housing stock. While I commend the people that work there and their work ethic and their passion for community, they don't have the capacity that New South Wales Housing had.
Okay. Now, the hottest question in the Bello and Shire, of course, is over the rolling out of the NBN. Do you see that as a state issue or a federal issue? Is there something the Greens can contribute to that?
Well, the rollout of the NBN is a federal issue, but it's an easy out to just say, well, it's a federal issue, I can't do anything about it. And how they're managing it in Queensland, where they're very unhappy with the rollout of NBN to particularly rural and regional areas, is they've started a state-owned company, or they're investigating starting a state-owned company to roll out the fibre optic cable to fill in the gaps that the federal initiative has left.
Oh, so they want to come in after the federal government and then extend that project?
Yeah, and fix it up to make it work. That's an option to be looked at. It is predominantly a federal issue, but state could look at some solutions.
Mm-hmm. Do the Greens have a policy on sustainable housing?
Absolutely. Sustainable housing is right up there. Firstly, again, I think is about renovating social housing, and that's going to provide jobs. Renovating social housing, putting on solar panels, putting on solar hot water, making it so that there's zero emissions by 2030. We put incentives for private dwellings and rental properties to become zero emissions, so renters can have the access to low power bills and low emissions living. We would also be empowering local councils to put in council housing, which is with renewable energy and zero emissions. So the initiative is called Cool Homes, Cool Planet.
Does the government have the power to empower
local councils?
Local council.
The state government manages planning, right? And regional planning has been slowly whittling away the power of local councils and centralising it to state government. We would be looking, if we're in a position to have power in government, we'll be looking at reversing that process and empowering local councils to do more to serve their communities.
Arthur, you've always been an educator. What changes would you like to make to the education system?
Well, one of the things is about the schooling resource standard. So when Gonski did his first review, they set a schooling resource standard, which is the basic minimum to educate each child. Under the reviewed system, public schools are missing out. 90% of public schools are funded below the schooling resource standard. 100% of non-government schools are funded above the schooling resource standard. We need to be negotiating more powerfully with the Commonwealth, and I would be looking at, firstly, restoring a fully funded public TAFE system. So we'd be looking at TAFE as the number one provider of trade skills. We'd be looking at cutting funding, no state funding going to private schools. If the federal government want to fund them, that's fine, but state government should not be giving funds to private schools.
Why have governments reduced funding for TAFE?
We have alternate providers now. We have non-government organisations now allegedly providing the services that TAFE used to provide. TAFE now have to compete. They just call it's a level playing field. TAFE have to compete with these non-government organisations, but the quality of education that happened at TAFE is far superior to the quality of education that's being provided by some of these private providers.
Mm-hmm. All right. Arthur Bain, thank you for joining me on Backchat today, and good luck in the state election.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. Thanks.